You have a story about yourself. You know it well enough that you can narrate it without effort, well enough that the significant events are organized into a sequence that makes sense, that has cause and consequence, that explains why you are where you are and who you became. You can locate the formative moments. You can trace the arc. The story is coherent, and the coherence feels like honesty. It feels like the natural result of having thought about your own life seriously and arrived somewhere accurate. The coherence is not evidence of accuracy. It is evidence of the editor's skill. There is a specific thing that people with well-organized autobiographies do, consistently, without naming it. They read the narrative's internal consistency as confirmation of its truth. The events connect. The arc makes sense. The explanation of how you became who you are hangs together without apparent gaps, without inexplicable transitions, without moments where the story requires more than it has. And because it hangs together, you receive it as a record of what happened, rather than as a construction of what the current version of you needs to have happened. These are not the same thing. And the distance between them is the distance between who you believe you are and who you are actually capable of becoming. The mechanism working against you is not a failure of memory in the ordinary sense, not forgetting, not distortion through the passage of time. It is something more specific and more structural. The present self is continuously revising the past in the service of its own continuity. Memory is not a recording device. It is a revisionist historian employed by whoever you currently need to be. Every time you access a memory, you are not retrieving it from storage. You are reconstructing it, and the reconstruction is not neutral. It is shaped by the identity you are currently defending, the narrative you currently require, the self-image that the story must support. The autobiography you carry is less a history than a political document. It was drafted to keep your current identity stable, and it is revised continuously in edits so small and so automatic that the revision feels like recollection. What becomes possible when you can see this, not intellectually, but in the specific way that makes the story feel differently weighted, is not a better version of the same story. It is the beginning of genuine relationship with your own past, which requires something that the coherent autobiography structurally prevents. The encounter with the parts of your history that the current narrative has had to leave out, explain away, or reframe beyond recognition in order to maintain the version of you that you have needed to be. That encounter is what this script is pointing toward, not revision, contact. If this channel is naming what you couldn't name yourself, subscribe. It reaches the people who need it through the people who found it. The person with the coherent autobiography, the one who can narrate their own formation with clarity and apparent insight, is often the person furthest from honest self-knowledge, for a reason that is almost impossible to see from inside the narrative. William James described the self not as a fixed entity, but as a plurality: the material self, the social self, the spiritual self. And his central insight was that the self is not discovered, but constructed, built through accumulated experience and interpretation and habit, and perpetually maintained by the ongoing activity of self-narration. What James saw, and what most treatments of his work skip, is that this construction is not passive. The self does not simply receive experience and absorb it. It actively interprets experience in ways that preserve the coherence of the construction already underway. The self is an ongoing project of self-maintenance, and memory is one of its primary tools. What memory does for that project is not record. It selects, emphasizes, frames, and where necessary, without conscious decision, revises, not fabricates, reweights. The same event, accessed at different points in a person's life, does not feel like the same event. Not because the person is lying to themselves, because the person accessing it is different, and a different person requires different things from the same raw material. The event does not change. What it means, what it proves, what it explains, these shift continuously in response to the current self's requirements. This is the mechanism. It is not pathological. It is how narrative identity works in every human being. The problem is not that it happens. The problem is that most people have no name for it, and without the name, there is no gap, no small but crucial distance between the story and the recognition that the story is a story. Apply this somewhere you haven't braced for, not to the painful memory you already suspect you've been telling wrong. Apply it to the version of your past you are most certain about, the story that feels least like interpretation and most like fact. The account of a relationship that ended badly, for reasons that were primarily the other person's. Reasons you can articulate clearly, that others who know you have confirmed, that have never seriously been challenged. This story, the one that has the quality of settled truth, is the one that has been most thoroughly edited. Not because it is wrong about the facts, because the facts it has selected and the weight it has assigned them, and the facts it has left in the background or explained away as exceptions, have been arranged with a precision that serves a specific purpose. They make the ending make sense in a way that preserves the version of you that needed to survive that ending. The parts that would complicate the arc, your own contribution to the conditions that produce the ending, the moments where the other person's behavior was a response to something you did, the places where you recognized the problem early and chose not to act on that recognition, these are not gone. They are available if pressed. But they do not organize the story. They are not the parts that surface first, or most vividly, or with the most emotional charge. The story has an internal hierarchy of salience, and that hierarchy was not assigned randomly. It was assigned by the version of you that needed the story to say what it says. Jung called the process by which the self-image is maintained the persona, the mask built in response to what the environment requires and what the individual needs to present as themselves. The persona is the curated self, organized for external legibility and internal coherence. And the autobiography is the persona's founding document, the story that justifies the current self-presentation as the natural and inevitable result of what came before. What the persona's founding document systematically excludes is what Jung called the shadow, the parts of the self that do not fit the narrative, that would complicate or contradict the arc, that carry the capacities and the failures and the desires and the choices that the story cannot accommodate. The shadow is not the dark side of the person in any simple moral sense. It is the part of the person that the autobiography has had to set aside in order to produce a legible protagonist. The protagonist of your story is not you. It is the version of you the story requires. This is worth sitting with. The protagonist of your autobiography has a consistent character across the narrative, certain recurring strengths, certain recurring wounds, certain recurring patterns that connect the episodes. The consistency is itself the product of the editing, the inconsistencies, The moments when you acted in ways the protagonist would not act, when your behavior was motivated by things the character is not supposed to be motivated by. These have been absorbed, explained, contextualized, made into exceptions that prove the rule. The rule was written after the fact. The exceptions came first. Now here is the part that most examinations of self-narrative stop before reaching. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, the specific psychological configuration in which resentment cannot be expressed directly and is therefore converted into a moral framework that makes the sufferer righteous and the cause of the suffering culpable, produces a particular deformation in autobiographical memory that has no other name. The person in whom ressentiment is active does not experience themselves as resentful. They experience themselves as having accurately assessed a situation in which they were harmed by forces outside their control. The resentment has been translated into a story in which they are not just aggrieved, they are correct. And the story is organized around the correctness of their position. What ressentiment does to memory is not invent events. It adjusts causality. The event happened. The sequence happened. What has been revised is the account of why. Who had power? Who exercised it? What the available alternatives were? What role the person's own choices played in producing the outcome they are still living with. The adjustment is small at any single point. Across dozens of connected memories over years, it produces a past that is coherent, emotionally consistent, and feels like history, and that has been specifically shaped to explain why things are as they are in a way that leaves the current self's position intact. You think you remember what happened. You remember what you needed to have happened. Dostoevsky's Underground Man is the purest literary case of this, and he is usually read as a study in wounded pride or paralytic self-consciousness. What is rarely noted is that the Underground Man is, above everything else, an autobiographer. The entire text of Notes from Underground is a self-narration, his account of who he is, why he is that way, what was done to him, what his intelligence sees that others miss. He is the author of the most internally consistent account of his own character in all of Russian literature, and he is throughout the person least able to see what his narrative is doing. The Underground Man's autobiography is airtight. Every part of it is accurate. The officer did look down on him. The humiliation was real. The intelligence is genuine, what the narrative cannot accommodate, what the text shows, around the edges of the monologue, in the gaps between what the Underground Man reports and what the reader can see, is the degree to which his choices have been organized around producing the conditions that allow the autobiography to remain intact. He has been arranging the evidence, not consciously. The narrative has been arranging him. Think about what this means for the ordinary person who is not the Underground Man, who is less extreme, who is not trapped in any obvious way. The question is not whether your narrative has been arranging you. It has been in ways that are less visible because they are less extreme. The question is in which direction and around which specific requirements, and what the arrangement has cost you in the parts of your life you haven't examined because the story already has a category for them. Arendt wrote about thinking, genuine thinking, distinguishable from cognition and from the processing of information through familiar frameworks, as the faculty that makes it possible to encounter your own premises as premises rather than as facts. Her account of the thoughtless person is not the stupid person. It is the person operating fully from within received categories who has never stepped outside them long enough to see them as categories. The underground man is thoughtful in every ordinary sense. He processes with extraordinary acuity. What he does not do is think in Arendt's sense, encounter his own narrative structure as something that could be otherwise, as a frame rather than as reality. The autobiography forecloses this. The person who knows their own story, who has it organized, who can tell it with fluency, who has arrived at what feels like understanding, is precisely the person most protected against the encounter with themselves that genuine thinking would produce. The story closes the loop before the thinking can open it. Here is where the expected answer arrives, and here is why the expected answer is wrong. You cannot revise your autobiography by deciding to be more honest. Honesty is not the obstacle. The mechanism producing the narrative is not deception. It is identity maintenance, which operates below the level of intention. The person who decides to tell a more balanced version of the story about the ended relationship, who consciously adds the parts they usually leave out, who makes a deliberate effort to distribute causality more fairly. This person has not changed the autobiography. They have produced an alternate draft for conscious use, while the original continues to organize their actual behavior, their emotional responses, and the spontaneous interpretation of new events. The autobiography is not the story you tell when asked about your past. It is the template through which new experience is processed right now. It is the pattern through which the present is given meaning. Revising the told version does not touch the operational version. The operational version is not in the words. It is in what the words are organized around. Frankl's account of the space between stimulus and response, the specifically human capacity to choose how to meet what arrives rather than be fully determined by it, depends on something he did not fully develop. That space is only accessible to the person not completely captured by their own narrative. Consider what this means concretely. Two people encounter the same difficult event, an unexpected criticism, a sudden change in plans, an ending they did not initiate. One person processes the event through the autobiography. It connects immediately to the existing arc, confirms a familiar pattern, produces the familiar emotional response. There is no space. The story already knows what this means. The other person encounters the event before the story can absorb it, sits in the gap where the meaning is not yet determined, and the response that emerges from that gap is not pre-scripted. The space Frankl was describing is the gap before the autobiography closes around new experience. Most people do not stay in that gap for more than a moment. The story is fast. It arrives before the uncertainty can do its work. What forces a longer stay in the gap is not reflection. It is experience that resists assimilation. I say, mais abamaos, and the event the autobiography does not have a ready category for, something that arrives in a form that the existing arc cannot absorb without significant restructuring. These moments are usually experienced as disorienting, as a feeling that something doesn't make sense, as the specific discomfort of an event that should fit and doesn't quite. Most people move very quickly out of this discomfort. The resolution is found. The event is reframed. The connection to the arc is located. The autobiography's continuity is restored. The moment passes without being inhabited. The moment where the story doesn't quite fit is the most important moment available to you. It is the gap through which something other than the protagonist is visible. What is visible there is not the truth about your past. That is not accessible, not because memory is simply unreliable, but because the events of your past have been interpreted so many times by so many versions of you that the raw material is no longer separable from the interpretation. What is visible in the gap is something different: the shape of the editing, the outline of what had to be excluded for the current version to be coherent, the form of the absence, which is almost always more informative than what the narrative contains. Jung's individuation process, the movement toward greater wholeness, toward the incorporation of the shadow, is not a process of excavating a buried past. It is the process of becoming sufficiently familiar with the autobiography's structure that you begin to recognize its requirements, not revise them, recognize them. The distinction matters because revision from inside the story is still the story. The protagonist who decides to be more fair-minded about the past is still the protagonist, still organized by the same founding document, still maintaining the same identity through a slightly updated account. Recognition is different. It is the specific experience of seeing the frame, not what is in it, but the fact that there is one, that its edges exist, that what falls outside them is not absent from the world, but absent from the picture. Most people do not arrive at even this, not because they are incurious, because the autobiography is not primarily a cognitive product that cognition can revise. It is an emotional and somatic one. It is organized by what you feel when you access each memory, the emotional tone, the physical quality of recollection, the specific weight that certain episodes carry. Changing what you believe about an episode does not change what you feel when you remember it, and what you feel is what tells your nervous system what it means. The story lives in the body. The revision lives in the mind. They do not speak the same language. What reaches the body, what can actually shift the operational autobiography rather than the told version, is not understanding. It is experience that cannot be assimilated without changing the structure that was doing the assimilating. A relationship that sees you in a way the protagonist cannot sustain without cracking. A creative work that externalizes something the narrative has kept sealed. A loss that the existing arc cannot absorb without the arc itself being altered. These are not choices. They are encounters. And the autobiography, which has been partly responsible for shaping which encounters you have had access to, will continue to organize the field. This is the most uncomfortable version of what this script has been building toward, that the story is not just a description of the life. It has been a partial author of it. The choices you have made, the situations you have entered, the relationships you have sustained or ended, have been shaped in part by what the autobiography required. And the recognition of this does not place you outside the requirement. You are still inside the story. You are still its protagonist. The recognition does not free you from the narrative. It only makes the narrative slightly less invisible, and that is not nothing, but it is considerably less than what most treatments of self-knowledge promise, and it is considerably more honest about what is actually available. You have a story about yourself. It is less true than you think and more yours than you know.